the attention that everyone has provided to this work that we're involved in. I know we took on some questions and had some back and forth this weekend, which is good because that tells me that that we're engaged and being really thoughtful. I do, as always, defer and give a moment or so to our chairs for the larger task force, Attorney General Stein and Justice Searles. Thank you for being on here. Do you have anything to address us with, suggestions, corrections? We look forward to hearing it. We'll start with you, Attorney General.
Just greetings. Really appreciate all the hard work everyone's doing. I know you're reading, you're studying, you're working, you're talking, emailing, and we're going to make great progress, and just so appreciative. And now I will go back offline so I can just listen.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Madam Justice.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Secretary Hooks. I just want to convey one thing that I could or maybe should have put in writing, but just from Working Group 1's meeting, and you all may be aware of this already, so I apologize if I'm repeating. But in Working Group 1's most recent meeting, they were talking a lot about training requirements, but one thing that they had a concern about was whether use of force reporting could also include information that would allow departments to assess the extent to which an officer's physical and mental well-being impacts how they handle situations of physical force. So that the concept being that stress impacts performance, and that if we have use of force reporting that somehow takes into account or measures the officer's level of well-being, physical, mental, and emotional, that would be useful. So I don't have any specific language or anything more detailed than that, but I did promise Working Group 1 that I would convey that to your group, because you're working on use of force reporting.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that does have some particular relevance. There could be a singular event where there's a fit for duty, which would do some evaluation of that. But also, some of the things that we're taking up is basically called an early warning system, and accredited agencies are already mandated to have that, and so that can be a built-in component of where it may not rise to the full level of a fitness for duty, but also the ongoing mental health and even the physical abilities of officers could be taken into account for those departments. So that's something that I believe that we certainly could take up off the top of my head. I'm sure that there's some other experts on here that could give some granular substance to that.
Great, thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. I am going to ask Greg to do, I say double duty, but it may be multiple duties throughout today. And whereas we are thankful for the added time, we want to be mindful of the time that we have to move through this. So each segment is laid out with a given time frame. So Greg, when we get to 1:20, if you would give us the 10-minute signal to let us know to draw the first discussion down within the next 10 minutes, and then we can move on to the next discussion on our agenda list and devote 30 minutes to that, and then we'll follow up with the discussions from the presentations and readings that we've been engaged to. I want to also open it up to both to Greg and to Jeff. I think what would help us go through the discussions with the use of force is the first topic that we'll deal with, is if we could have that put up on the screen, the draft recommendations. I know there was a lot of discussion this weekend and some good offerings and discussions back and forth on that, and I made a suggestion that perhaps we do take up some of the additional ideas that Mr. Pittman had brought to the group's attention, with the recognition that this was not a comprehensive use of force policy that was being offered, but then also to get forward movement. I kind of went through there based on my own perceptions of where we are with the working group and experiences to look at some additional items that I suggested that we may take up today as well. And so Jeff, who Welty is one of the primary drafters of the document, I'm going to ask him if you would, Jeff, and I'm putting you on the spot without asking ahead of time, to just kind of go through the use of force draft recommendation. And then, and I'm not saying we need to go line by line, but we need to certainly go topic by topic in this short amount of time that we have to see if there's any parts of it that cause a particular source of friction that drives us away from the consensus that I believe that we're heading in a number of these areas, or if there's some wordsmithing that would that you could particularly offer that would allow us to move forward for the group to consider. I want to do that at this time. So Jeff, I want to turn it over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Yep, we drafted recommendations 1 through 3 that are on the screen. The remainder came from Mr. Pittman's list. But with regard to 1, 2, and 3, I could just say just a very few words about each. Number 1 is the Sentinel event review idea. And obviously there's a whole separate document that's very detailed about how we're currently conceptualizing that those reviews would be done. That detailed document is still in flux. In other words, by no means is it a final document, but it's the result of collaboration between us, Working Group 1, who's looking very hard at this, the Criminal Justice and Sheriff Standards Commissions, the co-chairs have had some involvement in that. So there are a lot of people contributing to the details. And we can certainly talk about the details, but again, we're still learning and adjusting those and thinking those through and gathering stakeholder input. So I think today maybe focusing on the concept of doing Sentinel event review with, a dive into whatever details folks think is necessary, but but maybe not too far into the weeds would be helpful. The second idea is about data collection. I think there's pretty strong support for some type of data collection. The question that caused the most challenge in drafting is what definition of force are we going to use for purposes of collecting data? And there's some thinking that, hey, we really want to focus on data of use of deadly force or use of force that results in death, maybe even just to have a manageable administrative load and to focus on the most important uses of force. But at least in this draft, we went with a broader concept of reporting all uses of force, defined as any physical force used with or without a weapon to overcome resistance. That's a definition the Justice Academy provided. We could certainly look at other definitions, but that's intended to be very, very sweeping to collect the maximum amount of data. And we still would have a little work to do to figure out exactly what data is going to be collected, but we're thinking that the SBI, which currently collects information about traffic stops, is probably the right repository for that data and could work on exactly what data points would be collected. And then the third recommendation relates to the use of force against individuals who pose a threat only to themselves and not to others. And I'll just note for background here that our statute on use of force, which is 15A 401 D2, already arguably says that if a person doesn't pose a threat to others, that deadly force can't be used upon them. So we're entering into some territory that we may be redundant with current law. There's perhaps an argument for stating that principle more clearly in the statute, or to having it in agency policies as well as in the statute. I guess on the one hand, it's helpful that it's not really a controversial idea to the extent that it's embodied in the current law. But on the other hand, there's not as clear of a necessity for it, perhaps, although again, there could be some benefit or some symbolic benefit. So that's kind of where we got to on 1 through 3, and I'm happy to talk more about any of those at any time. And the remainder, I think everybody saw the email exchange between Mr. Pittman and Ms. Maxwell and Secretary Hooks over the weekend.
So this is John Letney. I have some questions and concerns on 1 through 3, if we are to the point of discussing those.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Chief.
So on the Sentinel event review, I think it's a good concept. My concern is in some of the other read ahead information, it refers to the medical professional and the Federal Aviation Administration. The medical profession, I've never heard of any of this concept being used. And I think if you look at the statistics of patients who die in a malpractice type of event or a medical event, it's significant. Yet I never hear anything about Sentinel reviews. So that is appears to be, I'm guessing, within the confines of the profession. So I wonder what the value is for that. The FAA, of course, we hear about that when the NTSB comes in, and they are looking forward how to prevent, and I think some good things have come from that as far as training of pilots and technology and understanding of weather patterns, things along those lines. One of the concepts of these Sentinel event reviews seems to be, it is not looking to find blame. It is looking to prevent future circumstances where that is possible. So I don't see anything in the documents around this concept that talks about the choice of the suspect to resist arrest or anything related to the dynamics outside of the police officer, the policy, and the agency. So that, I think, has to be a part of it, because I think, as we all know, any force used by law enforcement, by and large, I don't want to say always, because there's always that chance where it's not, but any legitimate use of force by law enforcement is likely going to be reactive in nature, where the suspect or the person who is being detained or charged or whatever is doing something to resist that lawful authority. So we have to factor that in. Secondly, if it is truly going to be not blame focused, I think there needs to be some protections written in there, which keeps it from turning into a liability situation, a quasi-investigative body outside of what is in place now, or what will be in place, that is truly a trained investigative body rather than a group that comes together to do these kind of things. So I'll stop there for a second on item number 1, and that's kind of my thoughts around that.
Thank you, Chief. As we affirm the Chief's points brought to bear, is there anyone else that would like to address that may have had some other readings or interpretations for Sentinel review, or other members that are likewise supportive of the Chief's position of those concerns that he has raised, recognizing that we do have an environment after any event where there could be a criminal investigation, internal affairs investigation, a review by a certifying body as to whether or not that officer remains an officer, that there are investigative activities out there, and in some locales, a review board as well. How does this play in to addressing the larger need both to ensure public confidence in policing with respect to our racial equity standpoint, and also to protect the integrity of investigations that there may be punitive or certification issues to bear.
Mr. Secretary, Sergeant Garton, I would agree with the chief on his first topic there on the Sentinel review, and if it's going to be a full-fledged, investigation for the purpose of learning, and maybe even for the purpose of trying to prevent the incident from taking place again. I think any of this, even to include the data collection, we have to make an avenue or a way to talk about the behavior. And I've said it many times, use of force is just what the chief said, a reaction based off behavior, and that's what should be dictating the level, the selection, and the application of force from police officers. So anything that we do has to have an avenue or at least a way to document and address, and then even apply the behavior and the reasonableness as it relates to the use of force. So my 2 cents is that we definitely have to have a way to address the behavior as well.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else?
Yes, this is Kerwin Pittman. If possible, can we have the document, the Sentinel Event Review document placed on the screen for us all to kind of see and kind of walk through it if that's possible, Jeff?
I think, Kerwin, the problem that we may have is that if we don't have it available to send to the individual members again, it's just really a timing through this. And so with that, I recognize too that we're working with, kind of in conjunction with this with another working group, and we could consume the entire time if we try to go through that Sentinel review as established. But if there, what I haven't heard, at least from the law enforcement members, is that there is opposition to a Sentinel review. It's just the details that as to how that is done. And so I'm wondering, and I'll open this up for the group, as to whether or not the concept of a Sentinel review is pushed forward. And then keep in mind that even though we're a working group, we don't lose our seat on the larger task force. And then with the synergy between the two working groups and then our role on the larger task force, continue to work to flesh that out.
Yeah, I think there's value to the concept. I think my concerns get into the details of how it actually operates. I thought the concept was very well thought out in that document. I did not see in the list of 20, give or take, local representatives, the agency head or a representative of the agency head. I saw law enforcement as well as other groups, but I think the agency head should be added. But that's a level of detail I didn't think we were getting into at this point. My concern is that this concept, which should be educational and forward thinking, would actually turn into being investigative, would also result in an avenue for civil liability or something else. So I didn't see protections in that other document, and I think we need to go methodically forward if this is the way we want to go, but make sure those details don't have an unintended consequence or a consequence that would create more issues.
Secretary Hooks, can I add an item about the liability question?
Yes, sir.
Chief Letney, you're making a good point that the intent is to be non-blaming, which the document reflects. And so part of getting to a point where the review would be non-blaming in the draft is to include that the review takes place after the any criminal case that arises out of the incident is adjudicated. So it's partly just a timing question. I do think that the intention as well is to ensure that the process and the outcome of the Sentinel event review itself is not to be used for civil litigation. And I cannot remember right now where that's placed within the draft, but I've got it in my notes that that's intended, and we can make sure that that's reflected in there. But that is the goal, is to have it be, it is an investigation. I mean, it's meant to be a detailed review, right, but it's meant to be a review that doesn't link or hybridize with the criminal or civil lawsuits that may come out of it. So that's the intent, and I've got it noted that if it's not in there, if it's not expressed properly in there, that it needs to be. And likewise, obviously, the behavior of the subject during any kind of use of force incident needs to be part and parcel of the investigation, and that's intended as well. But we can make sure that it's reflected correctly in there.
Okay, very good. Thank you. If we're done with this topic, I'll move on to a short comment of on numbers 2 and 3, or if there's more to talk on this topic, I'll wait.
All right, let me hear from one of the other public members concerning the Sentinel event review. If you can lend your thoughts to that for a minute. Ms. Nguyen, do you have something?
No, I was just going to echo your sentiment in the sense it seems that there's pretty much consensus around the benefits and of having a central event review. It's just a matter of what the details are. And I do think it is something related around the timing wise. You know, there are already sexual assault response teams that do something similar where after with regards to a case, and it's really can be done while it's still pending or after, but with this understanding that it's really one to identify patterns and whether they're patterns that where there is room for growth, but it's also identify things that were done right. It isn't a review is not necessarily already coming to the table with this idea that we're going to figure out everything that was done wrong. I mean, that happens to be one of the benefits is where are the patterns, where are these things that we can be proactive in developing different policies to respond to that. But it's also a great opportunity of identifying the things that go well and how do we incorporate that into our policies. And I think that a lot of it comes in on in terms of how we draft what you were mentioning, this piece of like, this isn't a punitive thing. This is really an opportunity for us to learn, and that folks that are getting to the table are coming with that perspective, right? And I mean, having worked with sexual assault response teams, it doesn't always feel great to be able to come to the table and say, my work is being scrutinized. But once you're able to build these teams and this trust, and everyone is on understands what the review is and what the review isn't, it does create trust where folks are able to dive into pieces that normally they wouldn't have. But you have to approach it in a mindful way. So I understand what the concern is, but I also think it is a matter of timing. You know, there are sexual assault response teams that operate different times. Some do post case review, some do current, open case review. But all of it, again, with the lens of how do we, how can we do what we're already doing better? And how can we avoid doing what we don't do very well?
Thank you, ma'am. Chief, let's go ahead and move on to data collection, the perspective that you were bringing to that, and then I'll offer a non-government member to comment on that as well.
And Secretary, this is a 7-minute heads up.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll be brief. I think we talked about this a lot. I think we can get to consensus on this. I would like to, at some point, revisit the definition. I think it is overly broad. So when it talks about any physical force, some would argue that putting handcuffs on someone is physical force, some would not. So that's just one example of how I think we need to be very clear about an all-inclusive definition, but not one that is so broad that it doesn't get to the goal that we're looking for.
All right. Thank you. Do we have a public member, that non-government member, that would like to comment on data collection for any either support or variance?
This is Kerwin Pittman. I'd just like to echo the same sentiment as the chief. We definitely want to have a clear and concise definition of use of force, but also take in mind as well when it says use to overcome resistance, to take into account incidents where resistance is not even present and yet it is still force being used. So we don't want to exclude that as well.
Thank you, sir, for that as well. Let's just in abundance of time, because we're able to read, and I know.
Secretary, just can I interrupt for 1 second? It's Josh. The only question I had on that issue was there is, I think Jeff mentioned this, that there's also reporting to the FBI. And I think the idea is to have it report to the SBI so we can have a little broader and more tailored set of reporting that we think fits North Carolina. I would like for you all to consider making sure that whatever we report at one level, even if it's bigger than what the FBI gets on their use of force reports, at least has those same questions that the FBI does, so that maybe we get more information that helps the SBI in North Carolina. But I think it's really important that we see where North Carolina stacks up nationally too. And so and then to authorize the SBI to share the relevant subset of information with the FBI so that there's both state and national reporting. We'd be able to compare with greater information and nuance jurisdictions within the state, but then we could also compare our state to other states, which I think is helpful too.
Thank you, sir. I think point well taken. Just for some additional context, the FBI reporting database is going to cover the more serious crimes and events and deaths. It does not cover all uses of force, and so that's why I think it's important that we do have that local data set. There has been an offering also that came through this weekend under number 5 of still participate in the national reporting with the FBI's database system, but also have the state reporting system in place. Of course, that comes with additional resources that are needed. We've already had some engagement with the SBI and with the Governor's Crime Commission about how we could positively impact that as well. The other benefit is that with the FBI already having data fields set, that could eliminate some of the variances between race and ethnicity and some of the data fields that are already set, which will give us an advance on moving forward with the state database. And so,
I apologize for not having read point number 5. That was exactly.
No, you're as usual right on point to making sure that we're focused on it, and I don't know that I would have readily thought about it at that time as well.
Thank you, Greg. Don't take their time away because I wasted everybody's time.
No, not at all, sir. Always look forward to the input. Concerning number 3, Chief, or did you or any of the other law enforcement partners that are here as a part of this working group have any thoughts that cause any particular angst or clarification or wordsmith offering?
I do, and I appreciate Jeff talking about the existing statute, and it likely addresses this anyway. My concern is in the language where it says a person clearly presents and so on, where it's only to themselves. So I talked in more detail about this previous meeting, so I won't go into all that, but it gets down to the dynamic and changing circumstance, and that a person who is only a threat to themselves at one moment can instantly turn to be a threat to the officer or someone else. And so we have to be very careful of that, very cognizant of that. And I think the Supreme Court has ruled consistently that the test is what a reasonable officer would have done under the circumstances. And I think that becomes a part of it. But I would be careful about legislating or writing policy that does not give the officer the ability to respond to a very dynamic circumstance and make sure that that officer, as well as the larger community, is safe. Now, that being said, I think we all can agree that the concept is good and that we don't want to use deadly force against someone who is not threatening anyone else. And that becomes a part of training. That becomes a part of what other tools and systems you have other than deadly force. But legislating it so tightly or having policy that is so tight, I think can be problematic and again have unintended consequences.
Thank you, sir. One of the things I tried to add when some of the first drafting came out was to put the word clearly in there to give folks some comfort, because there are dynamics, and so that clearly and I'll defer to our attorneys that are with us as far as drafting, is that with that reasonable officer standard or reasonable person standard, does that address that in companion with all what is already in 15A 401 D2, or whether or not there needs to be some addition to that. I'll ask Mr. Tally Wells if you have any input with that, because I don't want to move to the other discussions without at least giving our public non-governmental members an opportunity to weigh in.
Thanks. I've been holding off a little because I've got a number of comments for the next section. But my only comment actually goes all the way back to the beginning. You know, my one concern about the Sentinel event review is waiting till after the criminal case is done could, you know, literally take years or even longer, depending on the seriousness of the charge. I don't know that there's a way to get around that other than some sort of immunity, and that may also have to do with Section 1983 and things that we can't really get recommendations around, but it is a concern I have. And then I don't disagree with Chief Letney that there needs to be some sort of ability to take into account the dynamic situation. And I just wonder if there's some way to sort of have a little additional language that keeps, you know, that makes that clear that you know, using some sort of reasonableness standard, but I can't come up with the language right here.
Okay. Well, thank you, sir. Well, everybody's had an opportunity and we've reviewed through these, and before I move any further, I know that we're at the 1:30 time frame, but I'm also going to invoke a little privilege because at the beginning of the meeting, I spoke, and so I'm going to extend the time. But if Greg, if you would give us an additional 10 minutes on use of force before we transition to the next, that would be great. This weekend received some additional emails and feedback, and so and then I weighed in and asked that at least several of those be brought to bear that are listed under 4, 5, 6, and 7. And so what I'd like to quickly do is open it up to, well, there may be some additional ones there too, is to open it up to Mr. Pittman and Deborah Maxwell, who also engaged this weekend to see if I was on track with understanding the questions and the offerings, and then any thoughts that you have within a very limited time frame of touching base, advocacy for these being added on or to be taken up by the group, because I asked them to be put here as a suggestion, but the group, but certainly knowing that the group already had enough with the first 3, but these are very important, and they just struck me as something that we perhaps would have some ready consensus on. So I'll open it up either to Mr. Pittman or Deborah Maxwell.
I will begin, since Mr. Pittman illuminated these areas, I will let him finish up. My concern is that these things need to be there. And we're talking about things that are just going to increase the life of someone and not decrease the professionalism or the livelihood of the officer. The reason why the 4 is there is that people do get guns pointed at them and they get put back, and I get the complaints. Number 5, we've already agreed on that at the top. Number 6 is a definite. And number 7, first aid kits, we just had a lot of situations that have occurred. I can't remember names, I'm not good at that, but the use of the spit bag where the gentleman choked. Yet I know ours is sort of mesh so you couldn't choke if you use it, because I've seen them being used here. And so therefore, I hope that the group will agree and allow these to go forward. Because force is force. And as you said, we are the civilians. So when I see something like this as an impact, I am psychologically damaged. So just think of the person as we're looking at resiliency and improving race equity and decreasing racial discrimination within the criminal justice system. Mr. Pittman?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Deborah for highlighting those issues as well as extending the time, Secretary Hooks. So for my comments that I have for the Sentinel event review, I'll email them for the sake of expediting time, as well as the one issue I had with the data collection. But when it comes pertaining particularly to these use of force that I emailed over the weekend, looking at, I felt that a good chunk of it we could all come to a quick consensus of, and I know for certainly 4 through 7 we could definitely come to a quick consensus of, may have already somewhat came to a consensus of in the past. But I definitely want to still highlight the ones that was tailored and kind of see if I know some of them may require additional investigation and additional research into, particularly the utilization of de-escalation tactics, verbally creating distance, time, space, and tactical repositioning whenever possible. When using force, use the minimum amount of force when apprehending a subject with specific guidelines for the type of force and the tools authorized at any given level of resistance. Mr. Gartner hit on that earlier, basically creating an outline what we needed to do. To ban the use of tear gas, ban the use of rubber bullets, projectiles, which we can look into further. And it's a few more. When somebody's talking back to not use or running away to not use excessive force or force as a punishment for these things. And there's a couple more that I'm not going to get into for the sake of time, but we could definitely tailor them and definitely take a look back at those and see what we can iron out and what could be sufficient to put in play with what's currently going on and what has been going on. So that's all I have to offer. These 4 through 7 is pretty much cut and dry, in my opinion.
Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I'm just real quick, like number 4 and 6 and 7 have already been established here at the Raleigh Police Department, and I can only speak for the Raleigh Police Department. The reason why pointing a gun at someone is a use of force, and I think number 4 gets addressed with our definition, is because it's against the law. It's called assault by pointing, and anytime someone points a gun at someone, and even the police, it's still against the law. And so therefore the use of force report should be done. And that's kind of how it is here at the Raleigh Police Department. You point your gun at somebody, you got to do a use of force report. Hog tying's been outlawed, prohibited here at the Raleigh Police Department since I've been here for 19 years. And so I'm not sure what the other agencies are doing, but I think these are the things that we have to kind of touch on in our definition of what we're considering the use of force. And I'll jump right in on one other comment that Mr. Pittman made. And we have to be very careful when we start seeing banning of tear gas and lower levels of force. The more less lethal options we take off the table, the greater the likelihood that higher levels of force will have to be used. So we have to be very careful when we start taking these less lethal options away from agencies. But 4 through 7, I don't have any problems with them at all. And I think they get addressed really easy, like with the definition of the use of force.
All right. Can we show number 8, please?
Mr. Secretary, can I speak on 4 through 7 very briefly?
Go ahead.
Yeah, if we can move them back down the screen. Thank you. So there's been quite a robust nationwide conversation on what is essentially number 4. So while I understand Raleigh has their perspective, which I support, there are other agencies likely across the state, certainly across this nation, that do not. And there's some concerns around that. So I think we have to be able to operationalize any of these recommendations. And while I don't think we have time to figure that out now, I think it's a good concept, but we've got to get into the details of how this turns into policy follow-up and what do we expect supervisors to do. So there's more to it than just a blanket statement such as that. Number 5, we've addressed. Number 6, we need to define what hog tying is, because when a suspect is violently kicking, even though they may be handcuffed, they are not controlled when their legs are not controlled. There are ways to do that. There's a restraint device that may be used inappropriately to hog tie people. I think there is consensus across the nation that we don't transport people face down in the vehicle. So that should be an easy one. But some sort of way to secure their legs from kicking officers, kicking out windows of cars, being in law enforcement vehicles that don't have cages, kicking seats, that kind of thing is important to have that option. First aid kits, again, great idea. Most agencies have them, but I think we need to go beyond that, because a first aid kit is not going to help an officer deal with a gunshot wound or anything that is that serious. I think there needs to be a requirement around whatever the EMS service is in the community and accessing that as soon as possible, because those are the professionals and we can't expect officers to be EMT level trained. So we need to access that service that is hopefully already in place in every community across the state.
Thank you, Chief. When I looked at 6, I looked at hog tying, and I thought too the same. You know, there could be some definition issues, but I looked at 6 in total: hog tying and the transporting face down. And so that's why I thought that we could at least add this in here in the concept, because it's widely accepted that that tying somebody up, legs and arms and face down in a vehicle is asking for disaster.
I agree.
So we define hog tying as actually affixing any type of restraint to the handcuffs. So the rib hobble is what we use to address the kicking, and it does not get attached to the handcuffs.
Right. So I think the common meaning is what people imagine in their minds is all 4 limbs tied together and down in a vehicle. But I'll rely on Jeff to kind of wordsmith that out for us. Can you quickly show us 8? And this 8 is it's listed here as an early intervention system for those that are accredited agencies and those that operate under a lot of the IACP guidelines, even if they're not accredited. That's basically the early warning system, and that's to identify officers that have whatever number of complaints against them. I looked at the list that was offered. They just struck me as reasonable from my history and past. What you don't want is somebody saying we have an early warning system, and then it's so loose that an officer has to generate 20 complaints before there's intervention by the supervisor to take a look at it. And so these struck me as reasonable, and some that I've seen in draft proposals and/or some proposed language for accredited agencies to follow. So I personally gravitated towards some of those, but I'm welcome any dissent on if that appears to be too restrictive. And again, one of the emphasis is bad officers going from department to department because either they quit or something happens and then they show up elsewhere because they've not had that intervention while they're at their department.
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir.
I think in concept, again, great idea. Most of us who are accredited have these systems in place and they are very valuable. My only concern with this statement is requiring termination. I don't believe that we are able to do that for just having multiple reports. For example, because an officer gets complaints doesn't necessarily mean that officer is wrong. That officer is also should have the right to due process or procedural justice. Now, if it's sustained complaints, that's a different thing. But just the fact that they got complaints is not a reason to terminate because they have used force. Same thing. If they use force inappropriately or if it was excessive or unreasonable, absolutely, then we do not want those people there. But we have other avenues to do that. So an early warning system is supposed to be educational, corrective, aimed at looking at a variety of circumstances to identify a potential problem in an employee, some that can be fixed, some that maybe can't. But under C, to be terminating an officer just because they had multiple reports, I don't think is fitting the intent of what we're trying to accomplish here.
Well, Chief, would it suffice either one of 2 offerings for discipline for officers for multiple sustained complaints, or terminate an officer for multiple sustained complaints that would further move you toward consensus, if that's possible?
I think it would, but I also think we have to recognize that most municipalities will have a progressive discipline policy. At least I hope they do. And if they don't, they probably should. And that progressive discipline policy be put in place. And because there may be other outcomes, and there may be managers that need to be involved. There may be HR people that need to be involved, and so on. We don't want to force a termination that will then create liability for the agency for terminating someone without proper cause in someone's mind. But,
Right.
but the short answer is yes, that gets me closer.
Okay, I'm gonna suggest if Jeff and the task force members would consider a modification of and because these are our suggestions of suggestion of the disciplinary process following multiple sustained complaints, something of that nature, and see if that works. Well, first conceptually with the group, and then beyond that. I saw Greg come on, so I know that we're on this additional time limit. So Jeff, I'm going to go back to you. I think we have at least discussed all of these points and ask you to take the temperature of the group concerning where we're at and whether or not we're to the point whether it's the actual language that's in place or the concept that could be voted out.
Yeah, at least according to my notes, I felt like conceptually there was a lot of agreement on all of these items. The one that I wasn't completely sure about was number 3. We had a pretty brief discussion of that one. And then there was some desire to have a little more definition perhaps around the hog tying concept, and then some editing of number 8. So I'm happy to proceed however, of course, you want to, Secretary Hooks. I do think the group should vote on these recommendations at some point, whether it's a vote to approve them or a vote to approve them subject to further development and kind of a last look at the end of our process. But I think it'd be good to vote and kind of close this issue up a little bit, because we've got a lot of other really substantial issues we need to get to.
Yeah, yes, sir. I'm in full support of that as well. And so what I would offer to the group is that we go ahead and vote on the conceptual framework of these draft recommendations. And I will call upon the group members. And if you, in your vote, I'll give you an opportunity to express quickly, but because we don't have much time, if you would just say that you support some language modification in a particular area that would move you toward any greater consensus. So I'm going to start with the roll call with that. And Jeff or Greg, I think you may be keeping the tally. So I'm going to rely on you if you just call the members, and we'll do a voice vote.
Greg, do you have a list that you can easily call from? I just want to make sure we don't miss anyone else, but I think I've got everybody in my mind if you don't have a list.
I'll double check you as you call.
Okay, well, let's just start with the folks that I can see right this moment on my screen. So Mr. Pittman. And I think the question is a vote, and I don't know if this is kind of a vote on the whole roster of them with any caveats that you may have or any items that you disagree on.
Okay, yeah. I'm willing to vote yes with a caveat that we add additional language or detract additional language from certain ones to gain a better consensus. Or are we going actually 1 through 8?
Well, I think the question, and Secretary Hooks, tell me if you wanted something different, but I think the question is, do you support numbers 1 through 8? If there's any that you don't support, mention those, because if we don't have a majority on any of them, we need to know that. And then if you've got any caveats or comments generally that you want to make that could, help us as we refine them or work towards final recommendations.
Okay, well, can you put them back on the screen for me then? And so real quick so I can get it.
Sure, I think Greg can do that.
Okay, yeah, for a conceptual basis and just a conceptual basis when it comes to 1 through 8, I'm willing to support, particularly when it comes to the Sentinel reviews. It is a few concerns which might be more of just logistical concerns that I may have, as well as the sake of transparency. Number 2, particularly for the sake of transparency, I would like that provision to kind of be added in, but I'm willing to vote on that for conceptual basis. I think that is a great thing, as well as taking or detracting the use used to overcome resistance, because we want to keep in mind those who may not have even resisted yet sustained force Suicide, number 3, I'm definitely in agreement of, maybe with the caveat that we add some type of clarity. Number four, I'm in wholeheartedly. We have to keep in mind that we're creating these recommendations to be issued across the whole state of North Carolina for law enforcement and not just any particular department. So with that in mind, I come into looking at this as if no department in the state of North Carolina has these provisions in place. And if they have them already in place, that's a great understanding and a great deal already. But we must keep in mind for the rural places who do not have none of these in place, and we're trying to offer recommendations to ensure that the citizens of that area are good. So with that in mind, number 4, I've definitely come to a yes on. Number 5, definitely. Number 6, with the provision that we kind of assess what hog tying is. I like what Mr. Gardner said that Raleigh Police Department is doing, in particular to the restraints that they're using for the feet. And number 7 is definitely, I like that as standing. Simply because for the fact that aid should be issued whenever possible to try to save someone's life, regardless if they use force. If you got the power to take life, you should also have the power to try to preserve that life that you may have or may have not taken. Number 8, the last one, I definitely come to a consensus on the provision that Chief Letney spoke of could be added in there as far as when it comes to I can't remember his exact verbiage, but as far as when it comes to the termination part, but we definitely want to make sure, and to highlight that what Justice Earl said earlier. So for 8A, if maybe we can put if they received complaints within the past 2 months, then they receive some type of evaluation for mental stability within that provision as well. But I definitely support them with the means to kind of admin.
Okay. I've got that down, I think. Chief Letney.
Greg, can you scroll up to number 1 again? Thank you, sir. I'll say, so in concept number 1, yes, with the comments I made earlier about more details. Number 2, yes, with defining physical force and a whole use of force definition that is getting us to the goals that we seek. Number 3, while I support the concept, I don't support the legislation or policy requirement. That is a training issue, and or if it were to be in policy or legislation, needs to be worded significantly differently. So I don't support number 3 as written. However, I do support the concept. Number 4, no. Number 5, yes. Number 6, yes, building on Mr. Pittman's comment of defining hog tying. And number 7, I would add immediately render reasonable medical assistance, understanding what officers can and can't do, with a requirement to notify the EMS system that operates in the community to get actual a thorough medical care as soon as possible. Number 8, I agree with in concept. My only disagreement is about the termination, and I've already explained the reasons why.
Okay, made some notes about that one. Sergeant Garten.
I'll make mine quick since we've already been through the whole list. I'm able to say yes with the understanding that there's going to be some conversation about the language. When we get to number 3, I think the word reasonableness needs to be added in there somewhere, and I think that'll clear up some of the angst about number 3. But for the rest of them, I don't see any issues at all.
Okay, I got that one. Ms. Maxwell.
Hello. I agree in concept with all of the recommendations. As we move forward, there will be better, clearly defined, such as use of force, which needs a statewide definition. I need to have that on the record. Also, I will go to number 8 because a comment was made either by Sheriff Gartman or Chief Letney that was not the place for law enforcement to be an EMT. So if law enforcement cannot render medical aid, remember you cannot render mental health aid, and that's why we need social workers. And thank you.
That wasn't me.
Okay. I'm just saying each profession has to recognize their capabilities and limits. So that just leaves the segue for when we put social workers in on the next spot with stars and cahoots. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Wind.
Yes, I fully support all 8 points in concept. And I feel that there is some strengthening around the language around point 1, 2, 3, 6, and 8.
I'm sorry, you support those conceptually, but with the need for further review of final language, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Wells?
Yeah, that was greatly stated by Ms. Wynn. That's my opinion. I think particularly 2 and 3, we're going to need to revisit the language. I think one thought I have on number 3 is because you have the statute in the footnote, I believe, maybe this suicide exception sort of comes at the end of that in a way that doesn't prevent the earlier language. It would just need to be wordsmithed so that hopefully, Chief Letney's concern is taken into account of the dynamic situation.
Okay, that's all the members that I see on the call. I know we're missing the sheriff. Who else am I not thinking? Oh, well, Secretary Hooks.
All right. If you back up through 1, conceptually, I do support the recommendations and vote yes on that, subject to some granular details worked out for Sentinel review on 1, and support 2, suicide by cop on 3. I support the position of Chief Letney that we need, as well as what you laid out, Mr. Welty, that perhaps there's to be addressed by the legislature and an enhancement or to 15A 401, and perhaps the use of reasonableness added in with the clearly that we added in will get us there as well. 4, I clearly support because, it is, and I know people may define it differently, but we really want, and if we ultimately come with either require or encourage, either way, but I think that pointing a gun at somebody should be gone up the chain, and that supervisors should be aware of that. Number 7, I do think we should work on the wording because the 2 things is that, as the chief said, I don't think that first aid kits are enough to cover every situation, and we need to make sure that those trained first responders are in there to render that medical, and as Ms. Maxwell said, and sometimes mental health assistance. So I don't want officers just relying on their first aid kits that may not get the job done, but the concept of that is in most departments, professional departments, to render aid is certainly something I support. And then number 8, the last one conceptually, but I certainly agree with the chief. We cannot mandate a termination with various and sundry processes that a sheriff may have or a town may have, oversight boards, civil service boards, what have you, as well.
So it seems to me like there's at least conceptual approval for all 8 by a majority standard, and really almost by consensus for all of them. But on various of them, folks want some changes to the wording, and I've taken a bunch of notes about the conversation, so we can take another crack at that and then get them out to the group for hopefully at whether it's our next meeting or down the road a little bit, for hopefully a kind of a quicker up or down approval. I'll just note that people have slightly different ideas about how they'd like to see some of these changed. So we'll do our very best to reflect what most folks want. And we still may end up with things that aren't absolutely everybody's first choice, but we will do our best to reflect the conversation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all for that discussion. I know, again, it's run long, but it does not surprise me because it's use of force and it's critically important to what we're doing, and also can be critically divisive of us trying to get to a better place. And so I thank you for your time and attention. Again, in the future, there may be some time to take up those, there will be some time to take up those additional suggestions as brought forward by Mr. Pittman. I do want to caution all of us too, and Justice Earls touched on this a couple of meetings ago, is that our charge is to look at those issues that impact racial equity too. So, and it's not just about that we can bring across all ideas to change everything about how law enforcement operates or the criminal justice system operate, but our charge is to get at those things that create that racial disparity and that disparity in treatment for racial and ethnic minorities. So there are some policing tactics that we would never gain consensus on in a diverse group, but we need to make sure that we're focusing on things that impact racial disparities and moving forward. I'm going to pivot right now quickly to school resource officers. I think that we've had really, really good discussions on this, and I don't know that it requires as much, but I don't want to shut things down. So I'm going to jump right in. We see the draft recommendations up there. I'm going to ask Mr. Welty if he has any perspectives, and then I'm going to turn immediately to Mr. Wells because I know he's dug in on this issue pretty deep with us on the recommendations, and then I'll add back to a law enforcement government representative. Mr. Welty.
Thank you. The only thing that I would say here is that we drafted potential recommendations pretty broadly here. So for example, I think some of these proposed recommendations had very strong support within the group's previous conversations. There are others that didn't, as I heard the conversation, necessarily command clear consensus, but we erred on the side of drafting them and including them on this list so that the group could talk about them and decide whether the group wants to move forward with them. So I guess that's just a long way of saying, just because it's on the list doesn't necessarily mean we think everybody agrees with it or everybody's expected to vote for it. It's just a starting place for the conversation. I think there are some pretty clear consensus items, but some may not be. So with that, have at it.
All right, Mr. Wells.
Thank you. So I appreciate all these recommendations and essentially agree with them all. I would add just a few things. I would be explicit probably about the demographic characteristics, which I may not actually have been when I presented on this earlier, but I would have race, disability, grade, gender, and if possible, economic status, which and at least as a suggestion, that one's a little harder, although I think because of the school lunch program that may be available, but certainly disability or exceptional children status would be important data point. Even given what you said, Secretary Hooks, I still think that that's an important point, and certainly where there's an intersection of race and disability. For addressing behavioral concerns, I might add a suggestion as that all funding should be considered, including Medicaid, CHIP, personal insurance, and state funding. That may get a little beyond what we're talking about here, but I think somebody's going to ask who's going to pay for this. And right now, we've got schools should devote resources, and I also think it's incumbent on the state to help support this. And so I guess part of my response is just the fact that it says schools should devote resources, which I absolutely agree with. But in terms of who shoulders the financial responsibility, I wouldn't just leave it up to the school systems. I would also add that there should also be training for school personnel on mental health first aid and other mental health needs, including trauma, but that it be particularly not just for children, but for school personnel as well. Something I heard pretty consistently around school justice partnerships was a desire to have some sort of convening authority legislation for juvenile judges to bring the school justice partnerships together. And those are my main recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. I heard in Mr. Wells' oratory a suggestion that there be another added group for training in there. Mr. Wells, could you state that portion of it again?
Sure.
As something I would certainly support and would welcome to open up the other task force members to support that as well.
So I would suggest that there be an additional provision that there be mental, I mean, I would like it to be funding, but training for school personnel, all school personnel, including administrators, teachers, school resource officers, bus drivers, et cetera, on mental health first aid and other mental health needs of mental health and other disability needs of children related to behavior. Where I'm getting a little squishy on the language is how to make sure that we're including autism.
Okay. Sure, I certainly support that concept, and I see Greg is adding in some additional portions, and we certainly can recommend through the task force, and it can, you know, up to the larger task force, and if taken up, it will, that recommendation certainly could be shared with the legislative branch, shared with the judicial branch, and perhaps even use the pulpit that is occupied by the governor and attorney general to push for the funding for these initiatives.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'm not speaking for the attorney general or the governor, but I think that we can put those before them.
I like your suggestion so much. I'm fine if you speak for him.
All right. So let me turn to any one of our law enforcement members for some insight concerning this, and then I'll open it back up to our non-government members for some discussion as well, and then maybe this, you know, we may have some great consensus upon this, and maybe we can move forward. I don't want to short shrift it, but I think that we have greater accord on this.
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir.
Just a couple of comments. 1 through 4, I think reflect our previous conversations and are helpful, and I think will move us forward in accomplishing the goals. Most of 5, I agree with. Last meeting I spoke about processes for selecting and so on, and I think the first line is absolutely appropriate. My question comes around the last line. It says communities should also use advisory boards and other inclusive tools to monitor and provide feedback on the work of SROs. I think we always will get feedback on SROs. I know at least in our district, the principal of the school that has an SRO does a formal evaluation in line or timed with our annual evaluation process, so we get that directly. And while I think that's appropriate, and maybe the PTAs can work through the principal, the administration to provide that, I think the term advisory board could be misinterpreted to be a function of an oversight board that the law enforcement agency is partnering with, or that is part of that community, which may be appropriate. I just don't think we should put it on their shoulders without them accepting that. Number 1, or those that don't have that, now we are basically creating one. So I think the language should be tweaked a little bit. I think the concept is good to make sure that the entire school community has the opportunity for feedback. I don't think that that is a monitoring function, though. That's up to the administration of the school, the administration of law enforcement agency, and to make sure that they're aligned with the MOU and so on. So that's my comment on number 5. Number 6, I know a little bit about the recommendations of the Task Force on Safer Schools, but not enough of them. So I would like a little more information on that before we get too far into number 6.
Thank you, sir. I do take note on with number 5, and I do, I fully understand it. Advisory boards means different things to different people. I do, I'll let Jeff think through that and maybe some of our other substantive staff leads as to whether or not there's any better phrasing. But I do take note that it does say other inclusive tools. So it doesn't have to be an advisory board. Could be some other body, or inclusive tools doesn't necessarily have to be a hammer, nail, or computer program. I guess that could be the school boards or some group too. And so if we could maybe think if that's broad enough, or if I'm being too imaginative on that. Let me ask another public member if you'd like to weigh in, and then I'm going to entertain one more from the law enforcement segment, and then see if Jeff could take the temperature of us on this issue.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Secretary Hooks. First, let us recognize that schools depend on county funding. So the recommendations for additional social workers and psychologists, the Hanover County could do it, but perhaps Northampton may not be able to, or Halifax with 3 school systems. So there has to be a way from the General Assembly or looking for other funds also to help those other places to negotiate that. That's just a reality, sir. I don't know if that can be put in. Data collection is needed. It needs to be clear, concise, and being able to be retrieved immediately. It's tiring trying to help children and can't get the data to help support them in a timely manner. School justice partnerships, and the data should also reflect, are they alternative schools? I'm sorry, number 2 within that school system. And if within that alternative schools, what is the racial composition and gender composition of those alternative schools? Because those are used as feeders so that children are not suspended and the data then is not correct. When he mentioned Mr. Talley, I support his mentioning of training of mental health, but there also needs to be, if Associate Justice or Attorney General is on here, a linkage with DPI, because there's a lack of diversity training within school staff, which creates a lot of this usage of SROs that causes this. I know we're focusing on SROs, but we gotta go with the interconnectivity of why this problem occurs. So if they have the clout to talk with those individuals on that side and to see what they could do. Also, within the school system, there is a student support team that the SRO should be a part of. There's one, I believe, in every school. And also that person could be a member of the county community child protection team, because there's a hard time getting law enforcement across in different municipalities to support those things, which are ending not only a racial division, but also saving the lives of children. So I am in support of the process. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I also would point out, and I know that some of us may know more about the task force for safer schools.
About that.
Yeah, that is a mechanism where leaders are brought together, and that includes DPI, that includes members from public safety, that includes the Attorney General's office and a number of other people. So that ongoing work is part of why there was a suggestion of offering support the work of that task force that are coming up, and they really pull all that tie together to, just as you said, we're looking at SROs, but also about readjusting the mindset of administrators and teachers about not calling police in to help them teach their classroom when there's a discipline issue. And so that works hand in hand. And then also the leadership of the courts and AGs and the governor and the executive branch will go a long way to amplifying that work as well. All right. Sheriff Clemens is not on, so I'll turn back to Sergeant Garton. Any perspectives concerning SROs, and it's seminal to the work of law enforcement as it's constructed. And so with these recommendations out there, could I open it up to you, and then I'll turn to Mr. Welty.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It appears to me that the SRO is a very small part of this, but has the greater impact once they get involved. And I think as they're laid out, these recommendations kind of address that. And I think number one, where it's exactly where it should be at the top of the list, training the schools on just how to utilize that SRO. As far as the rest of the recommendations, I'm going to agree with what Chief Letney said. He and I are on the same page as it relates to the issues that he brought up. For, I think it was number 6. I too don't have enough information, but I do agree with them as they're laid out. So I don't have any angst with any of them.
Thank you. Jeff, I want to turn to you and so that we can kind of gauge the temperature and see whether or not there's a reasonable expectation of casting a vote on these. My sense is that there could be, and we can move through that fairly quickly. And so, Jeff.
Sorry, I just needed to unmute myself there real quick. Yes, so far I have not noted any disagreement in the discussion with any of the recommendations. I know Chief Letney mentioned some questions about the content of the Safer Schools Task Force, which Secretary Hooks then added a bit of background on. So I didn't see any red flags that would prevent us from moving to and through a vote. And I'm happy to call the names again if Secretary Hooks, you would like me to do that and make notes on how where everybody feels like they're at on these recommendations.
Yes, sir. I move and forward that we do.
Okay, so I'm going to go in the same order that I did with our last set, and that involves going to Mr. Pittman first. And the question again is, do you support each of these recommendations? If there's any you don't support, please say that specifically. And then if there's any change that you feel strongly needs to be made in any of them, I'll make a note of that as well. But we'll go to Mr. Pittman first.
Yes, could you scroll up on the screen a little bit? I support 1 through 4. With number 5, when it comes to community should use advisory boards or other inclusive tools, I think we should keep advisory boards on that one in particular, because we don't want to take the option of that off of the table for individuals to use this type of board that they may create for a check and balance. Number 6, excuse me, I support. Number 7, with provision, I was thinking that maybe if this training, cultural sensitivity training could be added, and a heavy dose of de-escalation training, if it's not already in these type of trainings, but just to specify that, as well as I was thinking that maybe that it might be good to have these resource officers to do some form of community service in the area that their school's serving. It's kind of hard to be somewhat biased against individuals who you have some type of personal connection or relationship to out in the community. So if we can add maybe a provision within the consensus of the group, if that's possible, that some type of community service hours for these SROs within the service area that their school provide be added into recommendations.
Okay, Chief Letney.
1 through 4, I can support. 5, I will support with the some more clarity around the language of the last sentence. As I've already discussed, number 6, support the work of the task force on safer schools. Absolutely, and appreciate the additional information I assume the recommendations we'll be able to see at some point if there's something formal coming out of that task force. And number 7, absolutely, I think funding for a more holistic view on providing service to the students who need it from a variety of perspectives will help that student and may limit the use of the school or the school using the SRO to do things that SRO shouldn't really be involved in.
Okay, thank you, Sergeant Garden.
Yeah, again, I'm in full support of the document. I don't see anything that I have an issue with. I will speak to the community service requirement. The SROs that I know spend a lot of unpaid time in their schools, attending games and just attending school functions that the different students have asked them to go to. So I don't know if a requirement would be necessary, but I do think it's something we could look at.
Okay, Ms. Maxwell.
I'm in agreement that we should proceed with these, and I like the recommendation about the diversity training.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Wind?
I also agree with the recommendations and underscore for point 5. Again, full support of this idea of incorporating the advisory committee, although strengthening the language or being more clear about the language is imperative around that part, and am also full support of the recommendation of the cultural competency and de-escalation part of it that Mr. Pittman brought up.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wells?
I'm in support, as I stated earlier. I would add a little more detail to the demographic data, particularly disability status under number 2. And the convening authority for juvenile judges for the school justice partnerships.
And Secretary Hooks.
Thank you. I support the recommendations as they are listed, and would also move to add the cultural competency and de-escalation as a part of that, if as some as funding opportunities would allow those and maybe encourage those to move those forward. And I also recognize the chief's concern. So if there's some more wording out there, because review boards, and I know there's a lot of discussion about that and trying to come up with different bodies and things like that. If I am fine with a modification for that as well, but I vote yay to the body of it.
Okay, so with that, it looks like all the recommendations have more than majority support, but we'll do the same thing. We'll do our best to revise the wording on a couple of them in line with what folks have noted and in our best guess at what reflects the will of the group. And we'll bring them back to you at some point for a kind of a final run through, but this one was pretty straightforward, I think.
Thank you. Let me just canvass the group as well as that, because we are trying to get some recommendations out. Would it be helpful if if staff leads have prepared because in my mind the conceptual vote is there. If they prepare the language and then we give some up or down voting through a survey. Let me first ask Jeff and Greg, and I think Jasmine's on here too as well. Would that work well for you all as far as collecting them, and then to the group, your comfort level of doing it that way? There still will be a record of it.
I guess my one request would be if they could send it out, Jeff, if you could maybe send it out a couple days before the survey, just in case we have a little wordsmithing we want to suggest before it gets finalized. And then I guess you and Secretary Hooks could finalize it if there's any final feedback.
Sure, yeah, we can do it.
All right, I hadn't heard any objections, so let's look forward to moving in that vein, and that way maybe we could move ourselves forward. Absent any objections, I'm going to pivot toward the discussions from our readings. We received a number of packets of information for us to read, and I know we've had some discussions generally about the Cahoots and STARS model. We did have a presentation on the co-responder model, and so I want to open the door. Really, we can revisit some of the Cahoots, and I know there was a video that kind of came to us concerning the STARS model out of Denver. I didn't know if there was an opportunity to show that short video. Greg, I don't know if that's possible or not. I'm not saying we have to. I just want to know what the possibility is with our time.
I can do that if you'd like me to.
Yeah, because this just came out today, right? So all the task force members may not have had an opportunity. It's only about 8 minutes long, and it may play well into some of the concerns that we have. Let me take a poll as to whether or not, well, hold on, Greg. Let me take a poll on whether or not folks are comfortable with the movement of the recommendations. Just speak up if you're not, concerning the way that we're talking about voting. If you have any concerns, or I don't say any concerns that would derail you from your participation in this esteemed group, please speak up. All right, thank you. I hadn't heard anything. And then also likewise, if you have any concerns, I know because we want to preserve presentation time, but this came to us and it's important, I believe, to our discussion concerning the short video that Greg have, if you'd speak up. Again, concerns that would derail you from your great participation. All right, I haven't heard any. So Greg, I wanted to make sure that we let the group participate in discussion. So over to you, sir. I see her talking, but I can't hear her, Greg.
I think you're on mute.
It basically looks at taking police out.
Okay, I might not be able to share the video. I thought I would be allowed to.
That's fine. We can defer. The group can look at that a little bit later. It was just, I was going to use it as a prompt for this discussions, but we have enough gravitas here at the table that we can just go ahead and jump in. Again, we've heard about the co-responder model, and then was brought to our attention about looking at the Cahoots model. We've had some readings, and the STARS model as well. I am cognizant that there is a program that is starting up in Fayetteville with the LEADS model as well, that Fayetteville PD is undertaking. And so we've been sent that material as well, and I hope folks have taken a look at that. But the essence of it is that law enforcement cannot take on every task. And so I think Greg has said he's been able to fix it. So Greg, let's see if this works.
Hi, my name is Carly Salon. I'm the Program Manager of Criminal Justice Services at the Mental Health Center in Denver. And I would like to tell you a little bit about the STAR program, which we rolled out our pilot here in Denver on June 1st. It's modeled after the CAHOOTS program in Eugene, Oregon, which has been in existence for about 30 years and has been very successful, and basically looks at taking police out of the equation when responding to low-level, low acuity, low-risk 911 calls. So last year in May, a delegation from Denver, which included representatives from the Chief of Police's office, our 911 Communication Center, several community partners, Representative Leslie Herod and Mental Health Center of Denver went out to Eugene and did a site visit for a few days and were able to ride along, and CAHOOT shared a ton of wonderful information with us, and it really made sense to us here in Denver. For a little historical context, we have a co-responder program that has been in existence since 2016, and that pairs a licensed mental health clinician with the Denver police officer, and they ride around together all day and respond to calls that come into the 911 system that have a mental health or behavioral health component. So we've had that program here for a number of years, and that has been very successful. We've seen great outcomes pairing a police officer with a social worker, and really kind of saw the CAHOOTS program as the 2.0 version of our co-responder program. Of course, when a call comes in through the 911 system that has a risk element or has a criminal element, but also a mental health component, we still want a social worker showing up on that scene. That's valuable. That clinical perspective, those de-escalation skills can be incredibly beneficial to the person who's being contacted, and also the officer who may need to solve that problem in the moment. So that's been very successful, but we also really want to keep police doing police work whenever we can and send the right response when someone calls 911 in Denver. Many of the calls that come across the 911 system are not criminal in nature. They don't involve a risk element. They're more public health resource calls or crisis calls that don't require an officer present. So our pilot program pairs a licensed mental health clinician with a paramedic from our local hospital authority, Denver Health, on a repurposed van that's kind of unassuming, stripped down. It's like an old, it's not pretty old, it's pretty new actually, a Sprinter van that we put kind of bench seats in and took all the city insignia off of it so that it doesn't look like a police vehicle or a city vehicle. And we stock some supplies on that van: water, Gatorade, electrolyte packs, sunscreen. It's very, very sunny here in Denver. Food, sweatpants, shoes, socks, sanitary items for women, hygiene kits, just anything that might solve an issue in the moment, practical things that someone who's in need may require when we come up on a scene. And that really helps one solve those problems in the moment. If someone needs a pair of shoes, we can get it to them. Someone has, wet socks from rain the night before, we can get them a fresh pair of socks. And it also really helps with rapport. So we're going on a number of calls with the STAR program, welfare checks, individuals who are experiencing suicidal ideation, who are not in imminent risk, who are able to wait for the STAR van to get there for us to chat with them. We are not lights and sirens. We don't run red lights. So any situation that we're going to needs to be stable enough to hang out and wait for us to get there. We get there pretty quickly, but unfortunately, we're not able to drive code 10 like the police officers and ambulances are. So it needs to be sort of a stable situation. We've also, run into resource calls, people who need transport to a shelter, people who were stranded here. They came down from Montana and lost their wallet and aren't able to get home. We've also helped people who are down in our 16th Street Mall kind of outdoor shopping area who maybe are having difficulty with their wheelchair and just kind of need some practical resources and support to get that problem solved. We have not had to call for police cover on any call that we've been on, and we've run almost 400 calls since June 1st, Monday through Friday, 10 to 6. And I think the fact that we have not had to call for cover really shows that we're making it to the right like calls. We are the appropriate resource for these issues that are coming in, and we're not showing up and kind of need backup to handle what's going on. One thing that I don't think we expected that's really happened a lot is that police are requesting the STAR van to come and take over the calls. So when a 911 call comes in through the system, oftentimes when you show up there, it might be a very different situation, right? It was called in by a passerby who was just kind of observing, maybe didn't know all the details. So sometimes it sounds like a call that's appropriate for an officer, but the officer shows up and sees that this is really more of a public health community resource call and is getting on the radio and asking the STAR van to come assist and take over. And that's happened quite a bit, which I think also shows that the police really buy into the STAR model and see the value in it. Kind of just as I mentioned, we carry police radios, so we are dispatched through the 911 system. We had those from our co-responder program, so it was pretty easy to stand up. We've seen great success. We've gotten great feedback from the community. A lot of the individuals that we have contacted have really given positive feedback, saying that this feels very supportive. We were able to meet their needs in a more appropriate way than the police might have been. And that it just felt comfortable, which is kind of what we're looking for. Of course, when it's a low-level call that just kind of requires a social worker and a medic, we want to provide that support the best way that we can. The paramedic carries a basic life-saving kit, so we're not doing any kind of treatment in transport or dealing with any acute medical needs, but they can triage individuals to the most appropriate level of care. They can do wounds care. They can check blood sugar. They have, really been useful in terms of individuals that we contact out in the community who have a medical issue, whether that be kind of something new or something chronic, and they maybe have questions, or they need to know if they are more appropriate for an ER or an urgent care. And that's really our goal, is to triage people into the most appropriate level of care, whether that's medical or behavioral health, and not just be using the ER as the catch-all, which doesn't really solve the problem and can also be very, very expensive. So that is kind of the quick and dirty of our STAR program here in Denver. We are planning to run for 6 to 12 months. So 6 months would take us right to December. And I would think here in the next couple of months, we'll be having conversations as to whether we need more data, or if we are going to continue the pilot for another 6 months, or whether we think that we've seen its efficacy and can roll out to a full program. So I hope that this was useful for you all. We'd be happy to answer any questions and are very excited to hear about this program being replicated across the country. Thank you so much for your interest, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you for that, Greg. Very helpful in leading into our discussions. And so, again, we're going to try to make good use of our time. And so I'm going to start off with going back to our process. We have been provided the materials, pre-select time for review. I know that this came a little bit later to us, but I thought it would be value added to jump-starting this as well. So for purposes of discussions and in our process outline, I'll jump in and start that the problem statement, and this is unrefined, this is just a few notes that I was just taking right then, is that law enforcement has been asked to deal with community issues that are better addressed, that are better addressed by mental health and social services experts. And that because law enforcement has been tasked to deal with these issues, that it has created opportunities for a lack of equity and maybe an increase in bad outcomes for historically marginalized communities and minorities in particular. And so with that as a ground foundation on the ground for us, and level setting back to the idea that is that we're not here to try to change everything about any particular part of law enforcement as a whole, but we're here to address those issues that would promote racial equity, particular, but also equities to other communities, such as communities with disability and the like. Is that I like to lay that foundation and open it up for discussions, both about what you've heard about the STAR program, what you've read about the LEADS program, the CAHOOTS model, and also the presentation that we received previously. Not necessarily trying to say we should as a group be endorsing any particular model, but this kind of feeds into the reimagining public safety. And public safety goes far beyond just law enforcement response. And so with that, I'd like to open it up, and I'm gonna select, if she'd like to join in, Ms. Angelica Wind, for your perspectives, if you'd like to offer some to us.
Thank you, Secretary Hooks. I think that you said it. In order for us to re-envision public safety, this has to be a part of the conversation. And I think it would be imperative for us to, again, not necessarily right now endorse one of the three, but I think that each one of them has its own strengths. And you know, what I can say is the CAHOOTS model at least has about 30 years worth of, you know, enactment in the community, and could provide us a little bit more information in terms of its efficacy. But just doing some reading around with the LEADS programs as well is that there are some promising communities that are going forward with the LEADS program. And I'm actually interested to read up a little bit more, because, you know, there have been some communities that haven't been as successful, but I do certainly am of support of looking deeper into one of the three and seeing if there was one that lent itself more in our community more than others, like across the state.
Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate your insight. I am reminded that we're fortunate to have Melissa Larson here with us from the NC Harm Reduction Coalition. And I hadn't asked her ahead of time, but I would ask her if she would like to unmute and lend some insight based on her work in this important area.
Thank you, Secretary Hooks. I appreciate the time and the opportunity to be here today. I am the Law Enforcement Programs Manager for North Carolina Harm Reduction. I've been there for about 4 years, and when I came on board, they were just getting started with the LEAD program, which is Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And they were just starting it at Fayetteville PD, which was in the fall of 2016. Some of the materials that I sent Greg yesterday that you may have had a chance to look at, you'll see that we have 6 sites across the state now. They represent about 15, 16 law enforcement agencies. We've got a couple more coming on board. This is a fantastic pre-arrest diversion model for individuals who are suffering with substance use disorder and they have chronic criminal justice involvement. That is the population that we're seeking to reach in this program. It does operate in a harm reduction foundation, which means that we understand that substance use is complex. Not everyone will be treatment ready the day that the officer attempts to make a referral to them. And we want to meet people where they are in their current situation. Demographics, sobriety, financial ability does not determine the likelihood of eligibility or participation. We do have a set of eligibility criteria established by the district attorney in each of those sites. Those are going to be those low-level drug offenses that we're looking to divert should the person come into the program. The North Carolina LEAD programs in particular were created to reduce injury and death amongst those who use drugs. And so this happened, of course, at the height of the opioid epidemic. There's many law enforcement agencies looking to do something different, recognizing that can't arrest your way out of it. And so the officers are able to use their discretion once they meet someone who has chronic substance use issues and also chronic criminal justice involvement. What we're seeing in our LEAD programs across the state is reduced recidivism amongst our participants, and also a higher level of engagement in treatment and supportive services. We are actually having a Duke evaluation of 4 of our LEAD sites. This is a 2-year initiative. We're probably about 1.5 years into it. It may go out a little longer. So there will be a point in time in which we'll have some outcomes and deliverables to be able to to share with the state and other agencies interested in it. But I do want to tell you why pre-arrest is a good thing, especially with training of officers. When we go in and we do the lead training, we're offering them cultural competency on the community that is actively using drugs. We want to discuss with the officers why people use drugs, the complexity of stopping or reducing drug use, and the stigma associated with it. We want to humanize it. And this is very similar to what you see in the CIT models, where we're teaching officers about mental health disorders and how that affects someone's life and the best approach. We don't want to use a criminal justice approach for something that should be therapeutic in nature. But we do need a greater understanding about the impact that the war of drugs has had on many of our communities. That is something that we do struggle with the LEAD program, is that there is unfortunately still quite a mistrust within the community. We need to build those bridges between law enforcement and community members, especially communities that have people of color. We do see some hesitancy in which they're not interested in joining the program. And so we do have to work harder to encourage that population. One of the things that we have with our LEAD staff members is that they do have lived experience. So it's always important when you can make that personal connection with someone. And then just lastly, moving forward, we would really love to see a greater understanding within the criminal justice system as of the collateral consequences of arrest, the negative effects that it has on family, employment, and communities, and not just arrest being a measure of activity amongst officers. But the LEAD philosophy, the law enforcement officers do see the buy-in there, and that's important. It's just a matter of getting them to understand the particular community that we're looking to serve. So I'll be here if you have any questions for me. I welcome them.
Thank you. At this point, I want to open it back up to Mr. Pittman, who is a advocate of some of the bottles out west. And so, Mr. Pittman, I'd like to open the floor to you, and then I'll go to Ms. Maxwell, who is always interested in operating in a way that embraces the mental health aspect of serving communities.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Larson, for taking the time out to present to us on what your organization is doing in particular. So I particularly like the STARS model, in my opinion. The CAHOOTS model is great. The LEAD model is great. My only concerns with the LEAD models is kind of make law enforcement the gatekeepers with that discretion of who receive this treatment in particular, as well as not having the lived experience. So it will be hard for anybody suffering from substance abuse to kind of relate and make that bond of building, especially now at the height of mistrust between the community and law enforcement. As well as my only concern with the LEAD program is the buy-in. So doing my research and looking at different things, if the officers pretty much do not buy into it, it will be a lapse in recommending and the effectiveness of the LEAD program. And I feel like that would only give them another tool or extension to use particular biases if they do exist within this particular individual. I like more of the STARS model because it is kind of like non-governmental officials dealing with and answering 911 calls, as well as law enforcement turning some of these calls over to these particular individuals, thus freeing them up to pursue other avenues that may be of pressing concerns and issues, and taking a social worker aspect out of their job and putting it into the right hands of individuals with that experience. And so you won't find a law enforcement officer riding around with a pair of extra socks in his car to lend to someone who maybe have been homeless and their feet have been wet from walking 2 days in wet shoes. And so it's just the humanity level of reimagining that public safety part for me kind of sold me on the STARS model per se.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Maxwell? And you all can, if you have a question, Ms. Larson can ask that as well. Ms. Maxwell?
Yes, Secretary Hooks. I don't have a question for Ms. Larson. Understanding that the LEAD program was instituted within the state of North Carolina to address the opioid epidemic, which was not an African-American or racial equity issue. So let's move forward in support of the STARS program, which is, like we said, revisioning public safety. That would be trained clinicians, licensed clinical social workers, make no mistake. Because when you put the hodgepodge of other professions, you may get someone who might be a licensed clinical substance abuse person, but that's it. So you need someone who can take the spectrum and the continual life of the populations that you're trying to protect, and they're trying to protect and serve. Mobile crisis lines, we already have through different facilities through our LME within the state of North Carolina. So therefore, maybe there's a usage of going through East Point Trillium or the name of the other one to find people who are already doing something like this to go ahead and jumpstart this program once it becomes a reality. And the reason why it may be different is 30 years ago, the Department of Public Health, as it was called at that time, offered to decrease infant mortality 2 models for all health departments to use. And that might be something you may consider. While I'm in favor of the STARS, there may be opposition, and that may be a way to move this forward. And I can find the models that were offered. One was called the O's and one was Parents as Teachers, but they offered each health department a different option and the funding for it at that time instead of just saying one thing. Thank you, Secretary Hooks.
Thank you, ma'am. Your insight's always important, and I think all of us on here recognize the lack of investment into mental health that has resonated across many domains and ended in the lap of law enforcement and then sometimes confrontational events. And so we want to do better by North Carolina.
Secretary Hooks, I forgot to say one thing. I was my precinct chair in the late 80s, and we held a meeting in my community to discuss what we would do. And the thought of going back and having any type of training or any type of treatment was looked upon by us at that time by law enforcement like, you must have a hole in your head. I'm sorry. So I'm glad to see that we are coming around at this time almost 30 years later. That just had to say that, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Wells?
I think my main point is one that you just said, Secretary Hooks, which is the need for mental health services. And I think we do have, as Ms. Maxwell's mentioned, the LME MCOs and providers, but there's a need for additional services and funding. And I think the reason I raise that is because all of these programs I am in full support of, and I don't have as much of a distinction between the programs as I do just the need for when we train officers on crisis intervention, when we have co-responders or however it works, that there be the supports and services to help sort of back those up and to provide the supports needed so folks aren't sort of as much in the cycle of needing or of the responses being needed. So I just think that in addition to the intervention trainings and whatever we have to have the interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think I have covered our public members, and that was intentional to let our government public safety members, all of us, to be good listeners. And so now I'm going to go to Chief Letney and Sergeant Garton for any perspectives of their reaction, but I know they don't mind being good listeners because they want to move our agenda and our communities forward. Chief?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think there's some great concepts out there and great programs. We've seen the success of STARS, we've seen the success of Cahoots, and we've seen the success of LEAD. Not only here in North Carolina, but in several other states. I have some colleagues who have implemented a similar program because there were no other services around. And while I agree that law enforcement shouldn't be the gatekeeper, we should be at the table and have an opportunity to divert people when it's most appropriate. And I know in some places that's been very helpful. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all model. I don't think that there's a way that we could say across the state we will implement program X, because to do that you have to have all of the resources behind it. And while in a metropolitan county, we may have that, in some of our rural counties, we won't. As Ms. Maxwell said earlier, in New Hanover County, they have certain resources. In Northampton, maybe they don't. So I think we have to look at what is going to be the most effective based on the resources that that community has, and ultimately, how can they best serve people? And I think law enforcement has a role in that, but I also think that the more we take the social work type of calls and put them where there are trained practitioners who deal with that on a more regular basis, we will be more successful in helping that person. We're never going to take the social work aspect out of law enforcement because we deal with people in the midst of their life experience. And sometimes that's not always a good thing. And we have to be able to have some sort of way to help. And a lot of that sometimes is the social work aspect, even though we're not social workers. So that's where the training is important. And we need to train officers for those kind of circumstances. And the issues in certain communities may be different than others. I've worked alongside some colleagues in areas where there was a large homeless population. And I can tell you that I know officers who do carry socks with them, who do carry extra clothes, who do carry bottles of water, who do carry snacks, granola bars, high energy fruit things to give to people during their shift. The compassion is one of those things that is very clear in our profession, yet also very unspoken about. And where officers can interact and interface, and as one of the read aheads we had talked about off ramps, where we can be an off ramp where it's appropriate. And not every circumstance is going to be, but where it's appropriate, we need options and we need ways to get that person into what they need. Maybe that's LEAD, maybe it's STARS, maybe it's CAHOOTS, maybe it's something else. But whatever it is with the appropriate resource behind it, I think is going to ultimately serve the goal that we all have, which is to reduce these law enforcement interactions where they're not appropriate and make sure people get the care they need. So there is not that intersection between law enforcement and folks with mental health or substance abuse or whatever it happens to be.
Thank you, Chief. Appreciate that perspective, particularly that law enforcement still, even with some adoption of models or additional resources, that there still has to be that public engagement. And so law enforcement needs to handle it because it's be able to be trained in that, so that because they cannot shy away from that interaction. And then shying away, and it's not a negative interaction, that shy away from positive interaction with communities, because that won't advance us if we only just go into a enforcement of the law mode. Sergeant Garton.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm going to, again, agree with the chief here. And being an officer who's been out on the street recently and been put in positions to where you recognize someone needs assistance, but the only option you really have and the safer option for them at that moment is a criminal charge in the jailhouse. And I think that's a sad fact, but it's true. And so as the chief spoke to the resources, no matter which model we decide or try to implement or try to put into place, the resources have to be there, because I've seen it time and time again where the end result being jail simply because there was no resources available and that person needing a safe place to be. I also want to echo what the chief said. I know many of officers who serve with probably a lot more compassion than gets reported. And I've seen it time and time again where we have passed out socks and food and water and things of that nature. And so as it relates to a series or a system, I don't know that we come completely off the table. However, I don't think you're going to, and I'm not an agency head, but I don't think you're going to find any agency who's going to resist some other professional response to some of these calls that maybe we just don't need to be the first responder. I think what we're looking to do is over time, mental health services, police showing up does not actually equal or automatically mean somebody's going to jail or somebody's in trouble. I think we want to get to a point where people in need of services go, okay, police is here, but they have the resources to get me the services that I need. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to jail or that I'm going to be charged or transported somewhere. I think we've have criminalized mental health, and it's time to really take a look at how we address those issues. And I don't think you're going to get, I don't know of any agency that's going to put up resistance for someone else coming in and trying to take some of that workload off the plate of the law enforcement agency.
Thank you, sir. And I think that that what you and the chief have articulated kind of encapsulates or captures how I feel as well. And so what I hope that there is a recognition, just even through this discussion, there are more things that unite us than ever divide us. But those things that divide us are serious, and we need to pay great attention to them. We are at the 3 o'clock hour, and I would like to thank Melissa Larson for joining us. Your insights, albeit brief, were timely and thoughtful as well. And I want to turn back to our substantive lead, Jeff Welty. And I know, again, Jasmine's on here. Is there anything that I've missed for today, absent the fact that I just can't create time and I'm not willing to cut off the great discussions and the work of these fine people?
I think for me, the one thing to recognize, and I'm sure many folks already do, is that some of these options are, number one, not mutually exclusive, and number two, actually targeted at slightly different situations. So for example, the LEAD, the law enforcement assisted diversion, is really a response when there is criminal activity, criminal drug activity going on, but a criminal charge isn't the best solution to that. Whereas some of what STARS is pointed at is when there may not be criminal activity going on. There may be a 911 call related to a person who's not functioning well or who needs assistance. They aren't necessarily doing anything criminal, but in the public safety system that we have, that's going to get called into 911 more often than not. So, there's, Chief Letney highlighted that maybe there's not a one size fits all solution. It's maybe a little bit more of a menu, and it's a menu where you might, in a particular community, choose more than one option. I don't know exactly how to try to articulate that in a recommendation, but we can work on drafting something up with the chair's guidance to bring back to the group next time. But thought it was a good conversation. And I just wanted to add one last thing, which is I know we have this process that calls for us to get everything to you on the Thursday before the meetings. And I promise you that Greg and I are scrambling to get you as much as we can, as soon as we can. We can't always control when we get things back from folks that we request them from, but we really are trying to bring you information in a timely fashion. So my apologies when it doesn't get there.
No worries. You all have been absolutely fantastic. Wouldn't trade you for any other team. Jasmine's with us. Jasmine McGee, any additional insights?
No, Jeff covered it. That's exactly what I was going to say. You can do more than one thing, and they're slightly different in terms of their lanes.
All right. And so I would leave you today with just, again, my sincere gratitude for the work and the time and effort that goes into this to drive for a better North Carolina and maybe even a better nation, because North Carolina has led the way on so many things. There's another opportunity to do this the right way as well. And so I thank you all for being a part of that. Perhaps at the end of the day that that these recommendations, as we discuss and look at some of the better things to educate ourselves and educate larger task force in larger North Carolina, is left with an encouragement that that municipalities and counties explore these various and sundry options, because they have to utilize what works for them. And we do want some uniformity, but recognizing that all communities are different. And I do think that Ms. Maxwell brought up a very salient point too as well. And it's not that she certainly, and not that I or other folks, but there has to be the same drive and recognition to address some of these other things as it was for the opioid crisis as well. Because even some of the energy that kind of goes on, we should not have to wait till some of these things hit middle America, what is considered middle America, for us to address it if we really truly care about everybody in North Carolina. And so with that, I want to thank you all, and I look forward to our next meeting.
Thank you.